Well, good evening, everybody. As Tom said, the presentation is going to be divided into three parts. And the first part, we're going to look at what kind of a world we might expect after the coronavirus. The second part, we'll be talking about actually what sorts of changes we would need to build that world. And then the third part is talking about what is the 99% organization actually doing today to try to make all of that happen. So without further ado, let's begin part one. So the next slide just shows the three parts that I mentioned. And the slide after that is really the beginning of the substance, which is this one, which is looking at the course of the virus itself. So this slide is looking at deaths over time. And as you may have noticed, the vertical axis here is a logarithmic scale. So a constant step up doesn't just mean an extra number of deaths, it actually means 10 times as many deaths. So there's a really big difference between those lines on the right-hand side there. And the numbers that I'm using for this are the numbers that the Financial Times has produced, which are more comprehensive than the government's own published death toll and probably a bit more accurate. So the slide shows four scenarios for what could happen from where we are today. And there's also a very faint line that you can just see on the left, which is what would have happened if the government had done nothing. It's called the laissez-faire line in the key there. And that's what would have happened if there had been essentially no action in mid-March, no lockdown. And the result would have been, by now, we would have had something over 400,000 deaths in the UK. Most of them would have happened by now. And for comparison, that's approximately the same number of people that were killed during the whole of the Second World War. So that's an extraordinary death toll. Now, fortunately, that didn't happen. We did have a lockdown. And when it came, it was in fact rather effective. So according to the Financial Times, the death toll so far is around 66,000 people. Now, that is a terrible number, but it's an awfully long way short of 400,000. So what could happen from where we are now? Well, the red line, which shoots up sharply, is what would happen in theory if the government aimed to remove all restrictions on public activity, complete end to lockdown, no social distancing, no restrictions on masks, no nothing. And if the public listened to that and allowed its behavior to revert to normal. And that shows a second spike, which would lead to almost the same number of deaths as that laissez-faire line. So again, over 400,000 deaths. Now that's not very likely to be what's going to happen. I certainly hope not. The yellow line is what would happen if the government aimed to unlock as far as possible without overwhelming the NHS. So in that case, the death toll could rise because the NHS isn't close to being overwhelmed at the moment. It could rise until we get back to about 1,000 dying per day. And if that happened, then you could see the death toll rising sharply there. And by April next year, we would have seen a death toll of around about 250,000 people, and it would still be rising. And the orange line is a slightly different one. It says, what if the government's strategy is to unlock sequentially, but to keep the rate of infection, you've probably heard of this R number, to keep that R number around 1. So in that case, the number of daily deaths would remain roughly stable. So by April next year, there would have been around 120,000 deaths. But again, it would still be rising. And in both of those two scenarios, because restrictions would still be in place, that's not talking about a total unlock, that would also be bad for the economy. So it would be, those two scenarios are kind of double whammy. And finally, the green line represents what would happen if the government followed the approach that New Zealand adopted, which was a hard lockdown, followed by a transition to what's called test, trace, and isolate. So when you've got the numbers low enough, you've only got a relatively small number of infected people in the population. You can actually track them, you can trace all the people that they've been in contact with, and anyone else you find that's infected, you can support them to isolate, and you can snuff it out. That's what New Zealand did. They essentially eliminated the virus in their own population, and now they have slightly opened their borders, but they have to be careful. They got 2 new infections from the UK, and by test, trace, and isolate, they were able to snuff it down and stop that spreading into a huge spike. So that's the green line, and the thick black line is the actual data up to a couple of days ago. So you can see that it's actually too early for us to tell for sure which line we're going to be following. The good news is, if we don't do anything stupid now, we've already seen the vast bulk of all the deaths that are going to come in the UK. The bad news is it's not 100% clear that the government does intend to avoid a trajectory something like the yellow or the orange line. But let's assume, at least for now, that we don't do anything silly, that we adopt best practice as shown by other countries, and think about what that might mean for the economy. So the next chart shows what the Office for Budget Responsibility thinks might happen. So that solid red line on the left is the OBR's estimates. And as you can see, they're saying there's an enormous plunge in activity in Q2, but a very sharp uptick in Q3 and 4. And the dotted red line is just saying, well, what would happen if after that we had 4% growth in the economy thereafter? The grey line, for comparison, is what actually did happen after the global financial crisis. So when you look at this, it's a rather curious picture where the recession that we're in the middle of at the moment is in fact far, far more serious than anything that happened in the global financial crisis. But the expectation is that we're going to bounce back much more sharply. So the obvious question when you see that is, well, is that what's actually going to happen? And the answer is nobody knows. Nobody knows, not even roughly, because it depends so much on policy decisions. So, Jen, if you could just click once more. If you imagine that we had a prime minister who was a committed market fundamentalist like Jacob Rees-Mogg setting policy, then probably at the end of the year we would have a no-deal Brexit hitting the economy just as we're coming out of COVID, and that could easily produce a double dip. So if you look at the bottom of this grey area, you get a sense as to what that might mean. And then if you followed that with savage cuts to public spending, you would get very, very low growth thereafter. So that bottom of the grey area is feasible depending on policy choices. On the other hand, if we had somebody like Clement Attlee or Franklin D. Roosevelt as Prime Minister in charge of policy, we would be expecting some kind of New Deal with much, much heavier investment, much greater support both for businesses and for people. And so that might produce a profile rather more like the top of the grey area. So if we think about the US New Deal, there was colossal investment, investment in buildings, investment in job creation schemes, reforms of banking, all sorts of things, which ended the Great Depression. And in the UK, after the Second World War, Clement Attlee's government followed the blueprint that had been set out in the Beveridge report and invested to build the NHS and to construct the welfare state. And in both cases, the results were good for the economy overall, but they were also far, far better for the typical member of society. So, the difference between the top and the bottom of those of that grey area is colossal. And when I've just described the results like that, it sounds like a no-brainer. Why don't we just go for the no-deal approach? Well, the obvious question that we'd have to answer is, what would that mean for the debt? Now, the Bank of England has a data set called the Millennium of Financial History, and that actually has 300 years of data on debt to GDP. So we can see that on this next chart. And if you could just move the slide on, Jen, for me, thank you. What you can see is on the right-hand side of this chart, actually the very last bit is from the Office for Budget Responsibility rather than the Bank of England, but they're saying we've just about hit 100% debt to GDP now as a result of this coronavirus crisis. Well, is that a problem? There are already an awful lot of voices telling us that it's a terrible problem, that it's economic Armageddon and we need to brace ourselves now for another round of austerity. But if you look at the rest of the chart, actually that's not what the data show. That green line represents the average debt to GDP over the last 300 years, since records began, in other words. And 100% is very roughly the average level. So it's not ruinously high, it's not unprecedented, it's not something we don't know how to cope with. It's actually just the normal debt that we've had over most of our history. So that means there is no factual basis for debt hysteria. And in fact, even if the debt went much, much higher, if you look at 1820 on that chart, that's about when the Industrial Revolution really took off, really started to have a big impact on the economy. And debt to GDP at that time was, as you can see, over 200%, double what we have today. And at the end of the Second World War, just before the golden age of capitalism, it was over 250%, very briefly. Now, those were the two most successful periods in our whole economic history. So very high debt is demonstrably not an obstacle to economic success. That's not what our history shows. What it also shows is that when you get that good growth, the ratio of debt to GDP plummets. This chart doesn't show it, but in fact, it's true that it's also the only way of getting debt to GDP down. Growth, we've never in that 300 years got debt to GDP down without decent economic growth. So austerity would be far, far more dangerous in all sorts of ways, but including in containing the debt, than actually the kind of investment that we need to make. So if you could just touch the button again, Jen. Thank you. The debt hysteria is actually much more dangerous than the debt itself. So I think we're going to continue to hear a lot of noise in the press about ruinous levels of debt and the desperate need to get government finances under control. Almost all of that will come from politicians and from journalists, and almost none of it will come from serious economists. And actually, this chart shows you the reason why. So we actually have a choice between a world of austerity or that New Deal style world. And what does that really mean for people? So the next chart shows what that might mean for median wages. So on the left here, the dark blue line is today's median wage. Today's median earner takes home a little bit under £25,000 a year. What will that figure be in 2050? Well, of course, it depends what policies we follow, what trends we follow. If we were to follow the trends that we have had up to 2010, then the answer is that it would be about 50% higher, almost, just under £35,000 a year. At the other end of the spectrum, if we followed COVID with a no-deal Brexit and permanent austerity, we could be looking at something much more like 16,000. So in the first case, the average person would have a far easier, far more comfortable life than today. Not luxurious, but much, much more comfortable. In the second case, most people would be either living under or not very far above today's poverty line. So the UK would have become a little bit like South Africa is today, where you have a small number of very, very wealthy people who are living surrounded by intense security, which protects them from the impoverished masses. Now, that process is what the 99% organization calls mass impoverishment. And that's what we were set up to try to prevent. And the crises we face actually are even not just the ones I've mentioned, not just COVID-19, Brexit and mass impoverishment. We've also got a climate emergency. So once we factor in the climate trends, the choice looks even more stark, and the next slide illustrates that. So on the vertical axis, you've got cumulative emissions of CO2 or equivalent. So that's how much we damage the environment. And we've got the real median earnings along on the x-axis. So you can see if we carry on as we've been going for the last 10 years, actually we will tackle neither of those problems. We won't tackle mass impoverishment. We will see people's income heading off down towards 16,000 or so. And at the same time, we'll be failing to tackle climate change. And actually, those two things will probably interact as well. So the picture could very, very plausibly be worse at that top left-hand end than this chart suggests. On the other hand, if we tackle climate change, and we invest to tackle climate change, we invest to produce that growth that we talked about, we could end up on what we've called here the 99% scenario, which goes off sharply to the right and produces a much more prosperous world, which is also much, much greener. So actually, we have a stark choice now that faces us in terms of what sort of world we want to leave for the next generation. Do we want to leave a world of mass impoverishment and climate change, or do we want to leave them in a world where, rather than being the first generation which expects to be poorer than its parents, they can actually expect to be substantially better off than their parents and in a much greener world? So why don't we simply choose no mass impoverishment, no environmental degradation, lower inequality, a constructive role for everyone in society? In other words, why don't we make that choice now and build a very positive future for our children? So we're going to have a break now to take questions, and then after the break, we'll come back and look at how we would have to build such a world. What would we actually have to do?
Great. Thank you very much, Mark, for that first section. I have to say, I find it refreshing and incredibly useful just to have that amount of data and explained to me as well. It's not always something that is very evident in much of the conversation that you hear going on.
No, this is, I think that's absolutely right. There is a huge lack of data. Even something like that chart with the debt, which literally would take any researcher less than half an hour to get their hands on, because it's on the Bank of England website and it's not hard to find. You don't see it very often. Now, anyone talking about the debt should be showing a chart like that. If they don't show you that chart, they're either very lazy or they're trying to mislead you. So I'm doing my best to put it all up there and show it.
Wonderful, great. Thank you. And just a word, so we're going to just make sure we pause for some questions for Mark. Just in terms of how to do that, well, I actually am now going to encourage you to use the chat function. So please, if you have a question, please just outline it in the chat. That's not how we'll actually ask the questions, but that's what we'll slightly use to filter them and maybe prioritize them if we have too many. I will then take a look and then, as best as possible, group them and ask you to then actually pose the question verbally as well to Mark. So we can carry on like that. So I hope that makes sense. So any questions you have could be factual or more philosophical. Please go ahead. Great, Jen. Do you want to kick off? You've got in there quickly.
Sure. Mark, you on one of the early slides there was a scenario plus Superman, and I missed any explanation of what Superman meant.
Yes. Quite right, good question. So I don't know if you remember, on March the 2nd, Boris Johnson made a speech where he talked about how his philosophical position on the virus, and how Britain, he said what the world needed actually was a country that was prepared to be like Clark Kent and to go into the phone box and emerge with its cape billowing and fly out there and continue to do business and continue to trade. He said, in all humility, Britain is prepared to play that role. And then I think the reality of the potential death toll of the virus hit, and that's why we had lockdown. But so Superman is a sort of code word that I used for that, a reversion to that idea of just ignoring the virus and just trying to let it all go and just get business running as much as possible. Devil take the consequences.
Thank you. And Jen, were you also asking about what about the US? Do you want to add that one in?
Yeah, I mean, maybe it's bigger than this chat. You can, but it's just interesting. Your projections were very UK centric, and you mentioned New Zealand, but it sounds like the US is doing a Superman approach in some regard, just kind of throwing off kind of conditions, and yet their death rate is spiking. So are they likely to hit that maximum in your view?
Well, it's quite a bit of work to keep one of these models operating. So I did actually, a couple of months ago, I built one for the US and one for the UK, but I just didn't have time to keep the US one running. So I'm not really fully on top of the US data. My impression from what I read is that it's a pretty dangerous situation, and there really is a very great likelihood that they're going to see a big spike in mortality. And one of the things that makes this all very difficult is that there's quite a long lead time from infection. So you can get a big spike in infections, and it might not be till about a month later that you actually see the mortality rates starting to spike. So what we do know, because it's historical, is that the US, the UK, Belgium, Brazil, and a few other countries have done really badly so far on the death toll when compared with other countries. Predicting how they're going to do in future means you've really got to model it carefully. And I am very worried about the US, but I haven't got the up-to-date model for it.
Thank you, Mark. Mark, there are a couple of questions around austerity, actually. Maybe the first one was from Andrea. Andrea, do you want to just go over your question? That'd be helpful for everyone else as well.
Yep. Thank you very much for this session, Mark. So I was just looking at that graph, the Bank of England graph, and then I heard you say, so this graph proves that austerity is not the only option. And I just thought, ooh, would you go over that point again, just so that I understand it?
Yes, absolutely.
Maybe just, Mark, apologies to interrupt. Just before you start, I think Jack just had a very similar one. Jack, essentially, you're saying what options are open to the UK government now beyond austerity. So that might pretty much be the same thing, Mark, I think.
Yeah, and something similar to add to that, you know, like Eisenhower post, he mentioned Clement Attlee there, and Eisenhower spent a lot of money, built out the roads in the US. You know, what options are open to the UK in terms of boosting the economy? You know, I don't think rail is going to be a big option because most of us now are keen to work at home. So is it broadband? Is it rolling out internet to places? You know, what kind of, it's kind of like, what would you stimulate the economy rather than doing big infrastructure is kind of the larger point.
So it's a very good question. I might duck it a little bit right now because the second part of the presentation is particularly going to look at that, and I don't want to steal all my own thunder by going into detail on the answer. But I suppose what I would say is, you know, we were told that there was no alternative to austerity, that there just wasn't any money. And Keynes said, I think in 1942, anything we can actually do, we can afford. And what he meant by that was that really the limit on what the economy can do is what businesses and the public sector can produce, the goods and services they can provide. If they can provide them, then by definition, we can afford them. And we have a monetary system which is called fiat money. So governments can literally create money. As long as they don't create so much that businesses can no longer meet the demand, actually they can stimulate the economy. Since 2009, the Bank of England has created, I think, 750 billion, that's £750 billion worth of money out of nothing in the form of what's called quantitative easing. And it actually hasn't caused any inflation at all. So that's a colossal amount of money that we know when it becomes urgent, when government decides there's an emergency, like protecting us from the environmental crisis, from the economic crisis, global financial crisis, they can do it. we now face, as I mentioned, we do have the COVID crisis, and they have been doing some more. We have a crisis of mass impoverishment, and we have an environmental crisis. They can do it again. So we're not short of money. The only question is, do businesses have spare capacity? Actually, every business that I know does have spare capacity. They're more worried about where the demand is going to come from than they are worried about their ability to meet that demand. So I think there's an enormous amount that can be done. And I'll talk in a bit more detail to answer the nub of your question in the next part.
Wonderful, great. We have a couple of other questions, I think, which we can just about still squeeze in, Mark. You'll need to tell us again whether you might be stealing your own thunder too much. But Pablo, could you go with your questions on how to encourage flows to responsible companies?
Yeah, it's basically regarding the graph, how to make it run to the place that we want it to run. So my question is how to regulate or entice capital to flow to companies that are socially and environmentally responsible, and probably not that financially performance-wise.
So there is a risk of me stealing my own thunder from both the second and the third part, actually, because one of the things that your question has raised is the problem of the profit motive, which is an enormously powerful force, and it should be a force for good. In an ideal world, if you had two businesses competing with each other, the good business would outcompete the bad one. The ethical business would outcompete the unethical one. But the problem is, as things are set up at the moment, one of the easiest ways for a business to increase its profits is to do what economists call externalizing its costs. So if I'm running a business, and let's say Tom's running a business, and they're in broadly the same line of business, but I am running mine in an unethical way, and Tom runs his in a very ethical way because he's, after all, a responsible leader, then I can create a big cost advantage for myself because I don't pay my staff a living wage, but he does pay them. So I still expect them to be coming to work alive, but somebody else is paying the difference between the wage that they need and the wage that they get. That might be the bank of mum and dad. That might be in-work benefits from the government. But in some form or other, the rest of society is paying part of my wage bill. Similarly, if I employ graduates, but I don't pay them enough to repay their student loans, then the rest of society pays for that graduate education that I should be paying my share of. If I drive on the roads but I avoid my taxes, the rest of society is paying for things that I'm using. And if I pollute the environment but I don't pay to clean it up, the rest of society picks up the tab. So when you're talking about how to get capital to behave sensibly, one of the key things is to say, how do we get the profit motive to behave properly? And actually, how do we re-engineer the definition of profit? And that's one of the things I will talk a bit more in detail about later. That's one of the projects that we've got going. It's a very demanding challenge, but we have started together with Imperial College and some other organizations to look at tackling that challenge.
We'll look forward to that in the next part. I think one final, more clarifying question specifically about the first part from Valerie. Omar, thank you for yours as well. I'm pretty sure that is going to be quite a large part of the next section. So let's keep your question back for now. But Valerie, you could go with yours, and then I think after that we'll go on to the second part.
Thank you so much. I was just wondering if you were able to elaborate a bit on the last chart and on the data behind it, because it's obviously very compelling. And if I quote this, I'd like to better understand the numbers.
Right. Well, the historical bits are just taken straight from the Office for National Statistics, which has a data series for emissions by year for the UK. And of course, it has real median earnings. That's for all earners, the data that are shown there. Then the continuation line is basically just saying what happens if we follow very roughly the trends post 2010, which have not been good. there has been, on the environmental side, there has been an improvement in those years, but not enough. So we would still get a long way past where we want to get to by 2050 if we continue with this slow rate of improvement that we've been seeing in terms of climate change. So we wouldn't tackle climate change. We're not tackling it aggressively enough, if you see what I mean, if we just carry on current trends. Yeah. But also, you know, most people are poorer than they were. Most people in this country are poorer than they were in 2007. So if that carries on, they will be much poorer still in 2050. Yeah. So that orange line is basically saying if we continue what we've been doing since 2010, people are getting poorer, so they would continue to get poorer. And we have been doing something about climate change, but we haven't been tackling it aggressively enough. And therefore we fail to tackle it. We don't meet our emissions targets. And therefore we end up in this top left box where actually we're failing on both counts. We're failing to tackle climate change and we're failing to tackle mass impoverishment. And actually those two things will probably interact with each other in an unpleasant way, so that the people who suffer most from the climate change will also be some of the poorest people, the most vulnerable people. So it'll probably be even worse than this mechanical projection suggests. So that is, as I say, a mechanical projection. The other one's also a mechanical projection that says, well, what if we could go back to the pre-2010 trends on income, which, as you can see, they were going up then, but at the same time, we aggressively tackle the climate change problem much more aggressively than we have been today. And I think this assumes that we could make a 15% annual reduction in those CO2 emissions to get to that point in 2050.
Wonderful. Great, thank you, Mark. Can I suggest we go on to the second part then? So it sounds like
yes, absolutely,
preempting quite a bit of it, which is great.
So in part one, we saw that there's a range of possible futures open to us, and we saw that at one end of that range actually is a very attractive future. So this part of the presentation is starting to answer the question that several of you asked, which is, well, how on earth are we going to build that attractive future? And actually, it's a complicated question because it's all about the economy, and the economy, you can think of it, it's the system that we've put in place as a society to provide valuable goods and services to people. And that's actually a very complex system. But you can, to simplify it, we can think of it just as a pie, where the size of the pie represents the total value of the goods and services that we can provide to everybody. And the slicing of the pie determines how much each person actually gets. So, of course, we don't all have the same size slices. So in this analogy, then, there are three problems that we need to fix. First of all, since 2010, for the last 10 years, the pie has hardly grown in the UK at all. Secondly, when it does grow, some of that growth is bad for the environment, which we saw in the slide we were just talking about. And thirdly, most people's slices are smaller now than they were in 2007. So when you say it like that, that does sound quite an intractable problem. But actually, in principle, the answer is fairly simple. Firstly, we need to make sure that when we do grow the pie, that growth isn't harmful. And secondly, we need to work out how to grow it faster and to share it more fairly. And if we can do those two things, then we will produce that desirable future that we talked about in part one. So if we start with this question of making sure that the growth isn't bad for the environment. And that's an important question because you do hear environmentalists sometimes saying, you know, we need to get away from growth, we need to shrink the economy because that's the only way to save the earth. So the way that I think about it is like this. You could split all economic activities into three buckets. There would be a good bucket, which contains all those activities which don't harm the environment. So for example, if I have a big tree planting program or a big house insulation program, that's good for the environment, it's good for jobs, it's good for the economy, that's good. So that's the good bucket. Then there's the could be good bucket, which is activities which in some ways desirable in themselves, but the way we're currently doing them has harmful environmental consequences. So agriculture is a prime example of this. Of course, agriculture is vital for society. We eat what agriculture produces, so we'd be dead without agriculture. But on the other hand, actually agriculture is one of the worst sources of pollution, not literally CO2, but methane, which in some ways is an even more dangerous greenhouse gas than CO2. So there are quite a few activities in that category where it's really important that we do it, but we might need to change the way we do it. So that's the could be good bucket. And then the third bucket is the bad bucket, which is activities where actually we would be better off without them. So in fact, fossil fuels are a good example of that. Environmentalists have calculated that we need probably to leave something like half or maybe even more than half of all the oil reserves that the world contains. We need to leave it in the ground in order to hit our climate objectives. So those three buckets are quite an important way of looking at the economy. And this is what happens when you look at it that way. And it's actually very good news, because you can see along the top, all the green boxes either have essentially zero or fairly small negative environmental effects. If they need any transformation at all, it's fairly minor change which is needed in those. And that's about 80% of the economy, which is essentially either already or not far away from being environmentally sound. And then you've got the other 20%, which really isn't environmentally sound. But of that, most of it fits into the could be good bucket. It's yellow. It needs major transformation. So we talked about agriculture. There's major transformation needed. Same thing obviously goes for electricity generation and so on. Transportation, all of these things need electrification. So major transformation needed, but actually, in principle, you can see how you would do it. And then it's really just the extractive industries, mining and oil drilling and so on, which cause a lot of the problem and would need to be shrunk. So this is really phenomenally good news, that if you imagine if we didn't have 80% of the economy in the good bucket and the other 20% in the could be good bucket, we could be facing a really unenviable choice between ending mass impoverishment and saving the economy. But this way, actually, we can see there really isn't an argument that says we shouldn't be growing the pie. It's just that we need to grow the pie in a sensible way. We need to make sure we have good growth, not bad growth. So that brings us back really to the question about the pie, and back to the experience of individual people. Actually, we need to work out how can we grow the pie, how can we share it more fairly. And that's a question about policy. And policy formulation is terribly complicated, but fundamentally there are only 4 types of policy, because every policy either grows the pie or it doesn't grow the pie, and it either shares it fairly or it doesn't share it. So this next slide shows that actually that means there are really only 4 types of policy. So if you could just click on the top right one, Jen, that's where we've got the shared growth policies. So for example, investment in R&D. As a country, we've been investing far too little, and in particular, far too little government investment in R&D, but also corporate investment in R&D, even though that is really the engine of our future prosperity. We've been massively underspending on infrastructure, massively underspending on education, massive underinvestment in healthcare. We haven't really been doing anything about direct job creation, and we haven't been supporting private sector investment. So all of those things we could do with doing a lot more of. Then on the top left, if you could just touch that one, Jen, thank you. We've got what are called captured growth policies. Something like widespread automation, for example. It does grow the pie. If we have very aggressive automation, it enables the economy to produce more goods and services. So in that sense, it's good. But it has casualties as well, because it may be good for the economy as a whole, but a lot of people can lose their jobs if you have aggressive automation. And if you don't do anything about it, that will actually exacerbate mass impoverishment rather than solve it. Which brings us to the need for the type 4 policies, these balancing policies, where it's really a set of policies that in themselves may not grow the pie, but you need to do them to protect the casualties if you have type 1 policies. And we probably do need some type 1 policies, so we probably need some type 4 policies as well. So things like retraining for people who've lost their jobs, raising the minimum wage, paying benefits to people who are between jobs, progressive tax changes, all of those things, they don't in themselves produce a lot of growth, but they do an enormous amount to share the pie more fairly. And then finally, we've got the type 3 policies in the bottom left, which are policies that neither grow the pie nor share it fairly. So at the moment, perhaps the most obvious example of a vulture policy would be a no-deal Brexit. The government's own analysis says that if we have a no-deal Brexit, that will shrink the pie significantly. And if the pie shrinks, you cannot avoid some people's slices shrinking, obviously. The people who see their slice shrinking won't be the hedge fund managers that have taken short positions against all sorts of British businesses and who are looking at the opportunities that a falling pound might bring. It'll be ordinary people who suffer. So vulture policies really we should be avoiding. So what we really need, if you could just do a couple more clicks, Jen, please. We need far more of those shared growth policies. We probably do need some type 1 and type 4 policies, and we need to avoid the vulture policies at all costs. So if we look back over the last 10 years, actually we can see that a big part of the reason we are in the situation we're in is that we had a lot of type 1 and type 3 policies, and we had far too few type 2 and type 4 policies. So what would happen if we shifted the policy mix so that it was much heavier on type 2 and it also had a balanced mix of type 1 and 4, but it didn't have any type 3 policies in? And that brings us back to the chart that we saw earlier. And it basically means we would be getting back to the sorts of trends that we've seen in our history, or even a little bit better, actually, because pre-2010 trends were by no means the best that we've seen in our history. That includes the global financial crisis and the recession that followed. So we could well be looking at something a bit better than that. So the answer is it wouldn't create utopia, but it would bring us back to that type of attractive world that we talked about in part 1, where instead of our children feeling, as I know many of them do, that they're part of the first generation in living memory that's expecting to be poorer than their parents, they should be expecting to be significantly better off than their parents and living in a much greener world. So in principle, building that attractive future really does look quite possible, but as you've seen, it does mean a fairly major shift in policy direction. And that obviously raises the question of how do we get that shift in policy direction, which is what we're going to talk about in part 3. But any questions now?
One question, Mark, actually, just as you ask, Ergem, why don't you go ahead and
Thank you, Mark. I just wanted to ask this one because I think this is sort of an important part that you just, in this last slide, you showed the difference between the post-2010 growth and the fixed inequality and inequality. Like, what is that you're talking about? The fixed inequality. What is changing there?
Yeah. So good question. So two things actually have happened since 2010. One is that we've had much lower growth, but we have had some growth, but we've also had rising inequality, so that the pie is a little bit bigger than it was in 2010, but most people's slices are smaller. So if we had been able to keep the angle of the slices the same, the pie is bigger, most people wouldn't be much richer than they were. in 2010, but they would be a little bit richer because the pie is a few percent bigger. And therefore everybody would be a few percent bigger if we had managed to fix inequality at 2010 levels. But actually, unfortunately, we did worse than that. Not only did we have a pie that wasn't growing very fast, but we allowed the angle of some of the slices to increase, which means that the angle of some of the other slices had to decrease. And it was unfortunately the people at the bottom who got squeezed most, and the people in the middle and the bottom, and so median income actually fell, whereas we should have expected it to be able to rise. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah.
Omar, I'm conscious we had your question after the first section. Is that question still in your mind? You're muted at the moment. You see, okay, it's been answered. Great. Sounds like, thank you.
Fantastic.
What other questions are there for people? In the absence, or whilst other people think of those, Mark, I guess I have one question, which I mean, maybe this is more of a political one than an economic one. I'm not sure, but why do you think we haven't been pursuing better policies so far? I guess, or maybe another way of asking that is, what are the barriers to getting through to those? What I guess we maybe collectively think are better policies for the next period.
Well, that's a very good question, and of course all of this is in some sense political, because how you grow and share the pie is a political question. I think that there are probably two things. One of the biggest ones is that we have all, and I would include myself in this actually, been brought up with a lot of economic myths that we've heard so many times that we believe them, and those myths, if you do believe them, tell you there isn't really any viable alternative to what we're doing, and nobody likes it. But for example, with austerity, David Cameron said, if there was another way, I would take it, but there is no other way. There is no alternative. And a lot of us believed it. I think, I can't remember when I started to be skeptical about that particular thing, but I think possibly at the very beginning, I did believe that austerity was needed. I know a lot of people did believe it was needed, and they did believe that the debt was very scary, because when people talked about it, they didn't show that 300 years of history, they showed about 20 years of history. And if you only look at that tiny little bit of the chart, it really does look scary, because you've got a chart where it looks as though it was going down and down, and that suddenly spikes up in a way that you've never seen before, and it looks unprecedented and uncontrollable. And I think there are probably literally 100 economic myths like that. And in fact, the middle part of the book, 99%, really tackles a lot of these myths. And what I discovered when I was writing it and researching it was that so many things that I had always taken for granted because I'd heard them so many times, when I started to say, well, where's the evidence for this? I just couldn't find it. The Bank of England didn't have evidence for it. The Office for National Statistics didn't in the States. The Federal Reserve Bank, which has very good data sets, didn't have it. The Bureau of Economic Analysis, the Bureau of Labour Statistics, none of them recorded all these myths that I had believed. And so I think that's a really big factor, that we've all been trained that there isn't an alternative. And if there isn't an alternative, we may not like it, but what can we do? We shrug our shoulders and we say, well, we'd better live with it. But if there is an alternative, then of course we can do something about it. And I think that's one of the biggest things. I think also there are some people who probably have been doing extremely well out of this slicing of the pie, and actually are very, very happy with the policies we've been following, and some of them are in positions of real influence, and that's obviously a second point.
Great. I think Omar has a follow-up question on relating back to this point. Omar, do you want to unmute yourself? And ask it?
Thank you. Sorry, this question may seem simple, but I'm not an economist. So I've always seen things as black and white. And on a personal level, I've always striven to not have any debts. So even,
yes.
I'm happy to share with my fellow responsible leaders and others that even in this crisis, what I've been doing is I've been overpaying on my mortgages. And
Yes.
I've always gone not to have any debt. So I've never really understood why on a macro level it is okay to have lots of debt, whereas in my personal level throughout my life, I've sought to do that. Lots of my friends who are into property
yes.
and so forth, they always feel comfortable with debt. And so I think,
yes.
is it an emotional issue? Is it a philosophical, cultural issue? Or is there more tangible intellect in what you're saying and in what I'm feeling?
Well, that's actually a very good question. It's not a simple question at all. It's quite a subtle question, because there's a big difference between what works for a household and what works for the economy as a whole. So if I start by just thinking about spending money, if I go to a shop and I spend £10, that's minus 10 for me and it's plus 10 for the shop. And that will be the same for every transaction that any of us have ever done in our lives. If you add up the two ends of the transaction, the total will always be zero. And therefore, for the whole economy, the total, if you add up every transaction in the economy, the total will always be zero. So you could split the economy into three bits. Traditionally, economists split it into three parts: the private sector and the public sector, and possibly if you consider foreign trade. But let's keep it simple. So we just have two parts: the private sector and the public sector. And the total of those two parts, the transactions will be zero. Now, it doesn't have to be that the total in each part is zero, but the total across the two. So that means if the public sector has a surplus, then the private sector has a deficit, and vice versa. So this is where it starts to get a bit strange. But what you're saying to me is, all my life I've had this feeling that I should be running a surplus. Yes. And actually that makes sense for you, because you're not allowed to create money. If I were allowed to create money, I wouldn't worry about how much I spent. If I spent a bit more, I would just go to my cellar where the printing press was and print off another million, and that would be fine. But I'm unfortunately not allowed to do that, and neither are you. And that's why we feel the way we do. And actually, we're right to be a bit careful. Some people are too careful, some people are not careful enough. But you know, we are right. If you're not allowed to create money, you do need to worry about debt. And so if the government said, well, we're going to behave as if we're a private sector household, we're going to run a surplus, that would force the private sector to run a deficit. So you would be forced, in effect, by the fact that the government was running a surplus, you, or maybe not you, because you probably still find a way of keeping out of debt, but that would be even more force on other people. Somehow, as a whole, the private sector would be forced into debt. Does that answer your question?
Wonderful explanation. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Very good question.
It looks like, I think there's a comment from Raj rather than a question, but Raj, if there is a question, do feel free to go ahead. Fataneh, were you thinking about a question in your head there?
Yes, I was, and I think I was mistyping it, so I had to do a double. Does that make sense? Can a government ever have too much debt, and how will they stand in the world, kind of in the world view?
Yes, well, that is again a very, very difficult question to answer. Theoretically, I think the answer is that it's not clear that there is an absolute upper limit, but that's a theoretical answer, and I think the safe thing to do would be to give the practical answer that we know that governments can run with quite high levels of debt for a long time. So you saw the 300 years of history where our average has been 100%. If you look at Japan, you'll see they've been running, I think, at over 200% for 20 or 30 years or something. But again, they are allowed to create money, so it stops it being a problem. If you imagine how you would run your household if you were allowed to have that very convenient printing press in the basement, you would run it differently. And Japan, like most countries, does have its own central bank, so it does have that ability to do quantitative easing. A country like Greece is different because it doesn't have its own central bank. It relies on being able to persuade the European Central Bank, which is not under Greek control at all. If it's under any country's control, it's France and Germany. So it relies on being able to get that central bank to do what our Bank of England does. And of course, it can't control that. And so, you know, Greece, Italy, any country in the Eurozone, in theory at least, potentially has a different and much more difficult situation. But for those countries which do have their own central bank, it can get pretty high for quite a long time. I would say, you know, we've seen practical evidence that it could be over 200% for quite a while. I've never seen evidence of a country running at 500%. So even if that's a theoretical possibility, I worry something might go wrong. But where we've got practical evidence, then I think that's safe enough.
Yep, that makes sense. Thank you.
And I see there was a question that asked about poor countries, and that's also a very good question. So countries like the UK and Japan, not only do they have their own central bank, but they borrow in their own currency. And the US, of course, borrows in dollars. But actually, a lot of poor countries don't borrow in their own currency, they borrow in dollars. And that then becomes a different matter because if they borrowed it in dollars, they have to pay it back in dollars. They may have a printing press, but they can't print dollars. So that puts them a bit more into the situation of a country like Greece. So Argentina, for example, borrows in dollars and regularly gets into difficulties paying it back.
Thank you, Mark. I hadn't appreciated that subtlety, that additional issue. May, that was something that I was hoping to kind of ask as well, actually, along those lines, or provide a little bit of challenge. And Mark, I think it's one that you say you often get asked about. So please go ahead, May.
So what was the question then?
I think May's just about to ask you. May, you're muted at the moment.
Oh, okay, fine.
In your model, there's no scope or space for this scenario of prosperity without growth. And what if we have, you know, kind of a very innovative government, and we have a revisited social contract embedding the carry capacity of the planet, and we don't need to grow, but we just need a different social contract. How do you see this scenario? Well, that we don't even measure growth via GDP, but well-being and what's happening in Slovenia, yes, and Costa Rica. We have some countries, yes, New Zealand as well, Scotland, and
yes. Well, that's a very complicated question. So first of all, you're right that GDP isn't really a very good measure for growth. It's the best measure that we actually have statistics for, which is why everybody uses it. Every country in the world collects data that way, but it doesn't measure everything. It doesn't measure a lot of very important things. But in fact, it only measures transactions where money changes hands. So for example, this event that's happening this evening, if we were charging for tickets, that would be part of GDP. Because we're not charging for tickets, it's not part of GDP, but it's the same event. It's just measured differently. So you're absolutely right that GDP does not measure everything. On the other hand, we do have a lot of people now in poverty or not very far away from poverty. So in this country, we have a lot of people who are having to choose today whether they're going to feed themselves or feed their children. And GDP is a useful measure for that, because that is money they need. To feed their children, they need to be able to go to the shop and spend money. So GDP is not a very good measure, but it's not a completely rubbish measure either, because money is very important, and money is particularly important if you haven't got it. So at the bottom end, GDP and earnings, cash earnings, are very, very important for determining the quality of people's lives. So if hypothetically we were to say, well, let's not grow the pie anymore, let us just change the slicing, that would be essentially a power question. Can we make sure that the slices that increase in that world of a finite pie will be the biggest slices, or in fact, is all the power in the biggest slices, and will it be the thinnest slices that get squeezed even further in that low growth world? And so my fear, based on the last 40 years in the States, is that the power is with the big slices, because money is power to a very large extent. And if we don't grow the pie, we will fail to tackle mass impoverishment. Does that answer your question?
Mm-hmm. Addresses, thanks.
Thanks, Mark. I think we're going to squeeze one more in, make the most out of this round before going into the third section. Raj.
Mark, thanks very much. You mentioned two reasons, myths and power, and you put the emphasis on, at least I thought you put the emphasis on the economic myths, and clearly they're very important. But I think what we've seen with the pandemic is that the power of the few is much greater than the influence of the thousands who've died unnecessarily. And so my sort of provocative question, I guess, and also the powerful buy into the myths. So I guess my provocative question is this really a policy issue, or is it not really fundamentally a power and political issue? And if that's the case, does that affect part 3 of your discussion?
Well, I think basically I have to agree with you. I think wealth and power are inextricably linked, and the more that you marketize everything, the truer that becomes. So if you had a society where everything was done in the market, then the only rights you have are actually rights. It's the right to buy something. If you haven't got money to back your rights, you have no rights. If you think you've got a need, but you've got no money to back the need, you have no needs. So in that sense, poor people have no needs in the market economy. In this country, if I have a need for healthcare, I can communicate that need by going to my GP, and my GP will look at me and say, well, yes, actually you do need an operation or something. I communicate my need by showing the physical evidence of it. In the States, I have to communicate that need by showing my insurance policy or my credit card. Otherwise, I have no need for healthcare. So absolutely, you're right that money and power are inextricably linked. I think you're also right that a lot of people with a lot of money tend to believe those myths. In fact, it's very convenient to believe the myth that the more money you have, the more value you have contributed to society if you're a billionaire, because it makes you feel good about yourself. If I look at the world, I don't see that. Actually, I see in this country, the UK's highest paid CEO last year was Denise Coates, who was paid £232 million because she runs an online gambling business called Bet365, and it's a very successful business, and she owns quite a lot of it. So she was by far the best paid person, at least in terms of what's called earned income in the UK last year. Does that mean she created more value for society? I believe she created negative value for society. But if you're a market fundamentalist, you have to believe that she actually created more value than 13,000 nurses. So, some of these myths that that we believe are, I mean, we don't all believe them, obviously, but you have to be quite prepared to do some mental contortions to believe them. And so you're right that this is a political question, and ultimately we have to change political policy, and that is what the third part is about, really. You know, how do we get those sorts of things to happen?
Thanks, Mark.
Thank you, Mark. Conscious of time, Mark, and keen to make sure we have enough time for the third section as well. So can I suggest we carry on? Well,
in part one, we saw that there's that range of futures that we could head towards, and we saw that some of them are not attractive, but some of them are actually very attractive. Part two, we explored the kinds of policies that we would need to do to get us towards those attractive futures. And so in this third part, we're going to discuss what will have to happen in practice to direct us towards that attractive future. And perhaps surprisingly, given how high the stakes are and how complicated these problems are, individually the things we need to do are neither particularly radical nor terribly complex. In fact, as that slide says, there are only 5 actions we need to take. So the first one is we need a democratic reset. We need some form of constitutional reform. At the moment, there's nothing in our unwritten constitution that stops the government from enacting a policy that it knows perfectly well will be harmful for the great majority of the population. We've simply taken it for granted that they would never do that. But the last 10 years, and in particular the last 1 year, have shown us very, very clearly that we can't rely on just taking it for granted. We do need constitutional protection. There are quite a few elements to that constitutional protection, but I won't, in the interest of time, I won't go into them all in detail. But we need more in the way of checks and balances than are currently present. If you look at the United States at the moment, you can see how fragile democracy is. It's just not clear that America is a functioning democracy anymore. If Donald Trump is re-elected, that may not be a fair election, and even if it is some kind of fair election, it might be the last fair one they ever have, because they're taking enormous steps towards voter repression, control over the judiciary, all manner of things. All the checks and balances that should be there to mean that a president isn't above the law are being eroded very fast. And we need to be very, very careful here that that doesn't happen as well. The second action is also self-evident. It's that we need to base policy on facts, not myths. So we talked about austerity, how that policy of austerity was justified on the basis of a myth. And we saw the data that said, well, that is a myth. It's not a fact. There's no fact-based justification. And that austerity was probably the biggest and most important policy that we've had for the last 10 years. The third action is what we talked about at some length in part 2, which is this idea about growing the pie and sharing it more fairly. So I won't go into that in more detail now. The fourth action is about investing more wisely in the future. Because we did have austerity, we've been unwisely underinvesting for a long time, but in particular over the last 10 years. So there's an enormous amount of catching up to do. And then the fifth action we did touch on earlier because somebody asked a question about it, which is ensuring clean, competitive markets. So as I said before, you know, in an ideal world, if Tom and I are running that those hypothetical businesses that we talked about, where he runs it ethically and I don't, in the ideal world, he would outcompete me and drive me out of business, and the whole of society benefits from that because the responsible leader has outcompeted the irresponsible one. The way it's set up at the moment, there's a real risk that I will drive him out of business, and the irresponsible leader is the one that sweeps the market. And Amazon is perhaps a rather scary example of that. It's a business that isn't carbon neutral, it doesn't pay its staff, it doesn't pay taxes, and it's hugely competitive. So we need to fix that, and we need to re-engineer the profit motive. So how on earth are we going to do that? Well, the next slide shows what it is that the 99% organization is in the process of building. And if I'd shown you this slide in June last year, it would have been completely blank because nothing existed. We hadn't written the book, we didn't have a website, we had no organization, we had nothing but an aspiration. That aspiration is what we've been talking about, ending mass impoverishment in these ways. So a little under a year ago, we published the book 99% and we set up the 99% organization, which is an inclusive, non-partisan volunteer organization. So if you're a market fundamentalist, you don't like what we're saying, but if you're sort of center-right or centrist or center-left, then these sorts of arguments, or green indeed, these sorts of arguments can appeal to you. And we are trying to be inclusive and have the people across parties as our membership. So what are we trying to do? Well, when it comes down to it, there are 650 people in this country whose minds we need to change. We need to change the way they vote. Those 650 people are our MPs. And of course, they need the votes of their constituents, which is us. So one of the things that we're doing is setting up local groups, and ultimately we'd like to have them in theory in every single constituency. And the ultimate objective is to reach a point where they can apply enough pressure to change policy. But of course, they can't do that on their own. So we're putting in place a series of pressure points which can help the local groups to make their arguments to their MPs. So the first thing was the book itself, which sets out in much more detail than I've been able to do today, both the nature of the problem, the root causes, and the solution. And it also contains a lot of facts which actually would be very useful to most MPs, because most of them don't understand this. And that, for the progressive ones, that will strengthen their hand in making their own arguments. And we're gradually working to improve our publicity. So the book was named by the Financial Times as one of the best economics books of 2019, which was helpful. And we've been gradually gaining an increasing profile on social media. And the next stage will be to get a higher profile on mainstream media. We talked about the need to create clean competitive markets. We recently, about a month ago, kicked off a joint project with Imperial College London with a project called the Impact Project, which is coordinating the global accounting standards setters, and with the Institute for Public Policy Research. And the objective of that is to produce a prototype league table of businesses which externalize their costs in the way that I was describing earlier. And that's a first step in what will be a long journey to re-engineer the profit motive. The first step is to be able to restate the accounts, restate the profit and loss account of the business and say, this is the true profit. We can then report on it for publicity purposes in terms of league tables. The accounting standards can begin to reflect it, which means a business like Amazon will have to admit that actually it's only really profitable because of this very large involuntary subsidy. It's really a theft from the rest of society that it gets because it doesn't pay its staff properly and it doesn't pay its taxes, etc. And then ultimately in making it illegal to do those things. And we're starting other projects with other organizations which will create further pressure points over time. So we've got that long-term plan to change the direction of public policy, and we are starting to work on it. But what are we doing in the short term? The next slide really just summarizes that, which is very, very simple. We are taking opportunities which are beginning to come to enable us to start to influence policymakers. But mainly what we're doing at the moment is trying to spread the word. Most people actually don't understand that mass impoverishment is a real issue, but that it's not inevitable. And that's really vital, that people understand it's not inevitable. Even if they know it's happening and they can see it might continue to happen, if they believe it's inevitable, they still won't take any action. So we've got a huge task in spreading that message. Unfortunately, the organization itself is growing fast. So at the end of last year, we had about a little over 100 members, but it's been growing very quickly. So we had hoped that by the end of this year, we would be between 500 and 600 members. In fact, we're over 500 members today. So by the end of the year, we'll be many more than that. And that's fantastic news, because those members have a very diverse range of skills and talents and experience, and that makes us an increasingly powerful voice, but also, perhaps even more importantly, with an increasing capability to undertake these important projects that I've been talking about. So just to summarize very quickly, in part one, we saw that we do have a stark choice, but also that it really is a choice. We can choose which future we want to move towards and what kind of a world we leave for our children's generation. In part two, we talked about the kinds of policy shift and the kind of shift in mindset, actually, that we need to move us towards an attractive future. And now you know something about what the 99% organization is actually doing day to day, if you like, and what its plans are for the future. So I'd just like to end by saying thank you very much indeed for inviting me to talk. And we do need your help, so please sign up on the website and join us. Thank you.